So these Christological controversies start appearing in late 200s, early 300s in the church, and last for about 300 years before we sort of get a lot of ironed out stuff. But arguably, they sort of really continue in some ways into the world today. We still hear several of them sort of bounced around in the church, but also we'll talk a little bit about them when it comes to the Great Divide, the Great Schism of 1035, which is sort of tangentially related to a Christological controversy. But what happened was the earliest church, so if you think about sort of the ascension of Jesus in, let's just say 33 AD and be sentimentalists about it, and say in 33 AD, Jesus died, rose, and ascended. So 33 AD until about 300, 325 AD, so you're looking at about 300 years, the church wasn't a thing. We were the people of the way, right? We were the way. That's what the book of Acts calls Christians. And there were these gatherings of people, we know because Paul writes to them, throughout the Mediterranean. But the idea of sort of a universal church, not exactly a thing, because it's illegal, right? Being Christian, and especially Christian in community, is illegal. Not because of the beliefs per se, but because of what the beliefs made us do. So I said this before, the big scandal, the big charge against the early Christians that sticks is that we are bad citizens. We're bad citizens because we will not offer the weekly sacrifices in the town temple, right? So that every Saturday, the town gets together, offers sacrifice to whatever the town god is for the providence of that god over the town. And Christians said, well, we can't do that. That's not our God. And so we just won't participate. And so we were actually being bad citizens by not participating in what was seen as the common good of the time. All that changes in the early 300s, when Constantine the Great, Constantine the First, Constantine the big face in the museum in Rome, Constantine, is said to have had a vision that preparing for battle, he had a vision of, we don't really know. So by some accounts, it's a cross. By other accounts, it's a Chi-Rho, which is the X and the P, which later becomes Constantine's own insignia. Regardless, it is clearly a symbol of Christ in the clouds, and the voice that Constantine hears says, "Under this sign you shall conquer." And Constantine legalizes Christianity. He is baptized on his deathbed, which isn't so surprising because that's what happens for most soldiers in the ancient world. But whether or not Constantine himself was truly converted or hedging his bets right before death, I'll leave that to Constantine to figure out. But the idea is that under Constantine, because this sign of Jesus, this Christian sign, is the sign under which he conquers, he legalizes Christianity, which means that we are no longer house churches, we're no longer small groups here and there, but this is sort of growing into at this point, international movement that now can build our big churches, right? So you get big cathedrals, and we'll look at some of them, right? You'll get the big Basilica of St. John in Lateran, like the first official state-sanctioned, state-allowed church building, huge. But it also means that you have to start adorning these things. And so the depictions of various Christian themes start to be made more public. But what also happens is, now that all of the little sort of community churches and regional churches start to talk to one another, they start to realize how much they don't have in common. Because there is no singular set of scripture. There's not even a single set of gospels. There is certainly no singular idea of teaching or preaching or worship. There's not even a single language. There's not even a single formula in which to baptize, right? We see in the early church differences between being baptized in the name of Jesus and being baptized in the name of the Trinity. So we realize that really the only thing we have in common is Jesus. But even there, we don't have it all put together yet. This is, when we think of sort of the fledgling church, this sort of early church, I really think that there's not much for us to talk about for the first, say, 200 years, because while there are some similar practices and we can trace a lot of our practices to that time, the idea of sort of formulaic, doctrinal, universal church is really sort of once it becomes legal. But it takes some time, right? There are 7 major ecumenical councils, which means that all the bishops got together to debate stuff. But in various ways, there is this, these ongoing controversies, as we'll talk about, because we just don't know what to do with Jesus, right? This group over here, usually from Antioch, because they're pretty faithful, but Antioch, so the 5 major metropolitan centers of Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. Those are the 5 major metropolitan centers of the early church. So Antioch will say, well, Jesus is fully human and fully divine. And Alexandria says, well, that's fine, but you can't be 2 things. So maybe he's only 1.5 things. And then Jerusalem pops up and says, well, no, but we know that he's, right? And so we start to have all of these debates. Some of them we will talk about as far as art. So these are the highlights. These are just some of the major controversies and heresies of the early church. There are plenty of other ones. If you ever want to know, just type in early church heresies and you'll get the whole Wikipedia page of them. There's about 100. So the most famous, and we'll talk about this one the most. The most famous Christological controversy is Arianism. That's Arianism with an I, named for Arius, who is a priest in Alexandria around 300 BC. CE. So these are all CE. I got my B's and C's mixed up. So about 300 CE, Arius is a priest in Alexandria who preaches on the docks and does so in song. And one of his favorite songs is "There was a time when he was not." There was a time when he was not. Because what he's saying is, and this is a direct quote from him, if the Father begat the Son, right, only begotten Son of the Father, if the Father begat the Son, then he who was begotten, that's the Son, that's Jesus, had a beginning in existence. And from this it follows there was a time when the Son was not. Meaning that Jesus, as we would say now, right now in the 21st century, after all these heresies, we would say that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, the first, second, and third persons of the Trinity, are all co-eternal, co-majestic, co-blah, blah, blah, co-powerful, co-whatever, right? They're all equal, just different. But what Arius is saying is, but if we can pinpoint a time when the Son was begotten of the Father, then there's a beginning point for the Son, which means he has to be less than God. So that the Son of God must be less than God. The second person of the Trinity must be less than. Arguably, Arius will use the language of creature. Jesus, the Son, the second person of the Trinity, is a creature, one who is created by the Creator. Generally speaking, Arianism looks at Jesus as sort of superhuman, more powerful, more, closer to omnipotent, right? Closer to divine, but human nonetheless, right? Born of a woman. And this borders on another heresy known as adoptionism, which is this idea that Jesus is fully human and God adopts Jesus in the baptism. This is my son, the adopted one. And in that, Jesus sort of takes on some divinity. The thing to keep in mind about this idea of sort of superhuman Jesus is that apotheosis is a very common thing at this time for most of the emperors and their wives and their lovers. Apotheosis means that is the deification of a human. So what happens is Julius Caesar dies. In order for Augustus to get sort of some more credibility as the emperor, he says, well, but Julius Caesar was descended from, right, what was born of Venus and Mars and the sort of born of the gods, which sort of puts this divine lineage into the emperors. Indeed, Augustus himself labels himself son of God, right, because he deifies Julius Caesar, and therefore he himself is son of God. A lot of language that we hear in the Bible about Jesus, but this idea that when the next emperor took over, particularly if that emperor was a child or a relative and not just one who killed the last emperor, but if it was sort of a natural inherited progression, often the previous emperor, their spouse, their lover, their whoever, right? Antonius Pius deifies whatever his name is. Anyway, but basically deifies them. And so we actually have these reliefs and these statues of the apotheosis of blah, 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 which basically means they weren't a god until they died, and now the gods have made them one of them. That's kind of what Arius is talking about with Jesus, or at least what Arianism will talk about with Jesus. Born human of Mary, out in Nazareth somewhere, but ends up being the Son of God, right? And in that way being deified. So it maps on to what many Christians would have been hearing elsewhere throughout the empire. Another one is Apollinarism, named for Polyneis of Laodicea. Again, this is about a little closer to 400. This talks about what's happening inside the person of Jesus. So most everybody agrees that Jesus had a human body, right? He showed up, people saw him, he looked human. Apollinaris says that his soul, the seat of his emotions, was human, but his mind was divine, meaning that that's how he understood and talked to God, right? And we start to try to figure out what's happening inside of sort of the human body of Jesus. Nestorianism is another big one, named for Nestorius, Bishop of Constantinople, a little more like 450. This held that there were two natures of Jesus, fully human, fully divine, but they were sort of both fighting each other inside Jesus, right? They were kind of elbowing each other for room inside Jesus. In this, part of the big struggle with this is when we start to talk about what's happening inside of Jesus himself, right? So if we look to Arianism, it's about what is the beginning of Jesus? What is the sort of creation, if you will, of Jesus? Once we get to a point where we recognize Jesus as fully human on the outside, we try to figure what's going on the inside, because we can't deny the fact that he died. But that is so not like God. How can God die? And so we start to say, well, Nestorianism sort of leads into this argument. We'll hear a bit more about it in a few minutes. This sort of idea that in the crucifixion, because there's these two natures of Jesus that kind of struggle, the human nature dies, but the divine nature kind of just hangs out for a while and then is resurrected, and so Jesus, when he's resurrected, is fully divine, right? Because we just don't know what to do with this, right? We're still trying to figure it out, because we're still trying to grow. We're still trying to dig our heels in. We're still trying to, gain followers, figure out who we are. And so we don't know what to do with all of this confusion of various things that are going on, all of which somehow appear, depending how you read your scriptures, So we're trying to figure out what to do with them. Larry, was that a question you had, or you're just raising a thumbs up? You're muted.
Thank you so much. The first interlocutor, Aryanism. So that first dude sounds like he was sort of an apologist, just going along with the traditional ways of the Romans saying, well, you're born a human, but you die a god so that your offspring can then become gods. So that sort of seemed, are you saying that sort of fit in with the way of
I'm saying, so what I'm saying is, it's not that, by no means is Arian trying to, I mean, Arian is very much a Christian, and in that way would be considered a bad citizen in the earlier church. But no, what I'm saying is, these teachings that Arius was coming up with and that we talk about now might seem a little confusing to us now, but would not have been surprising, right?
Yeah.
In the same way, trying to talk about Son of God means something very different to us today. Because right now, if you were to talk about Son of God anywhere in the United States to anyone, most people would think Jesus, right? Even if they don't believe in Jesus, would know that is language for Jesus. Son of God would have been anyone who was the emperor. And you know, there was sort of this map on. And so we start to have some of the same language and teachings that would have just been part of the vernacular. And Jesus would not have been the only person labeled Son of God, right? Just that wouldn't have been a thing, because there would have been these other ones. And so that's basically what I'm saying there. Mm-hmm.
Whereas Nestor seemed to sort of be like, he's trying to balance an incredible concept there.
Well, and that's the problem, right? We are not even sure what the concept is that we're trying to balance at this point. We're just trying to get it all out there and figure it out, which is why we end up with people like St. Nicholas. Yes, that St. Nicholas decking Arius in the face at the Council of Nicaea, because it gets so heated and no one knows what's happening, right? So that we actually have fist fights among the bishops, because people are just so like, so when we talk about trying to wrestle with these concepts, there was like physical bishop wrestling moments trying to figure this out. So mostly, and I misspelled this, but it's Monophysitism. Monophysitism, the people that believe in it are Monophysites, meaning that there is only one nature of Jesus, and depending who you talk to, it's either human or divine. One of the most famous Monophysits is Docetism, which is that Jesus's human body is an illusion. This body is there for your sake, so you can recognize it, but really, Jesus was the non-corporeal Spirit of God appearing and working in the world, so that what this does is it explains how Jesus could have appeared to have died. But we don't have to touch God dying. See, so all of this is, first we have this concept of God born of woman. That's problem number one. That gets solved pretty early, right? Mary, very early on, is known as the Theotokos, the God bearer. It's the label Luther loves most for her, the God bearer. Nestorius and the Docetists will only go so far as to call Mary the Christotokos, the bearer of Christ, but not the bearer of God, right? And so we start to wrestle with, is Jesus at all divine? If Jesus is divine, then how do we wrestle with Jesus' death? Because if Jesus was really, truly, ultimately 100% dead, which he was, then that means God was dead for about 36 hours. And today we would say, well, it's a mystery, right? It's part of the mystery of the Godhead. It's just part of the Trinity. But it's 2,000 years later. At the time, we're still trying to wrestle with how is this, and how do we explain it in a way that the world can better understand, because we're still not super popular, even though we're legal. And so we start to wrestle with what this means. So I want to look at some art. All of the art today comes from the fabulous city of Ravenna in Italy. If you ever have a chance to go, go. I will fully admit I have most of these pictures on my computer. These are not my pictures. The computer that I have from Ravenna, sadly my screen doesn't work, so I have to figure out how to get them all off. But I have very similar pictures to these. The reason why we're focusing on Ravenna is because Ravenna has a very interesting history. Ravenna, Italy is, for a significant period of time, the capital of the Roman Empire. It also goes, within 2 centuries, goes through a whole handoff back and forth between the Orthodox, don't think Eastern Church, think those with right belief, those who win the heresies, right? And Aryans, which by the time of these buildings that we're talking about, any one of these Christological controversies, whether Docetism or Nestorianism or Polyneism or Arianism, they're all lumped together as Arianism. Basically the idea, anything that is denying the hypostatic union, it's known as, but anything that denies the hypostatic union of the two prosopoi within the person of Jesus, right? That the idea that Jesus is 2 natures, fully human, fully divine, they don't get mixed up, but they also can't be separated, right? What Ambrose of Milan will say is that it's not like oil and water, it's like wine and water. Wine and water are 2 different things. If you were to get down to the microscopic level, you would see wine and you would see water, but once you mix them together, you can't separate them. Oil and water eventually could be separated, right? And so that's what we're talking about. Anything that denies that gets lumped into this Arian category. So just that's the fascinating thing about Ravenna, because it goes through this back and forth, is that for just about everything that there is church related, there's both the Orthodox and the Arian version of it, right? So that there are 2 baptistries, there are 2 cathedrals, there are, multiple mausoleums for the various emperors that were there, sort of in this back and forth. And if you really sit and look at them, as we will for a few of these, they really just copied each other, but changed the things that didn't map onto their belief system. Because remember, we have some major differences here, right? For the Aryans, we are denying that Jesus is fully God. The Aryans, deny the full divinity of Jesus. Superhuman, or these 2-person, these sort of 2 natures that wrestle with each other and know when to jump out and not, or whatever, right? But it denies the full divinity of Jesus, and it shows. One of the most famous, and so what happens is when we look at these beautifully extant mosaics from Ravenna, which, we're talking like the 400s, these mosaics have been standing in place. They're gorgeous. They are far shinier and beautiful and cleaner and lovelier than they look on the screen in front of you, but they are still there. And what you can do is you can trace the back and forth of the controversies just in the pictures. So we're going to take a look at some of those, and this is how we're going to start our series. So this is the Baptistry of the Aryans. This is the Aryan Baptistry in Ravenna. It is a round building at the top, as you see, but it ends up with 8 sides at the bottom. In the middle of the floor would have been the large pool. You would have walked in naked, walked out the other side. Someone would have clothed you in your white robes. All of this for adults only at the Easter Vigil. In the dome, as you see here in the very center, is the depiction of Jesus being baptized by John. That's John there on the right. And the Holy Spirit descending like a dove upon him. And the personification of the Jordan River is hanging out next to them. Again, for us to remember that in the ancient world, rivers and seas and everybody had a spirit. And so it was very common for major bodies of water to actually have a person that was the depiction of them. And so this is the personification of the Jordan River, hanging out in the water with Jesus. If you zoom in, and I think I have a zoom in here, if you zoom in, there's two things, and so then what happens all the way around the outside is these are the 12 apostles, so that's 11 faithful disciples plus Paul, who are carrying their crowns of triumph to lay at the foot of the empty throne on which there is a cross. This, in depictions of art, this empty throne is a hetoimasia. That is hetoimasia. It is the empty waiting throne symbolic of Jesus. This is Jesus, the return of Jesus, right? It is the throne awaiting Jesus' return to reign. And so it is usually bejeweled. There is often a footrest, as you will see right here. There's a cushion, it's lavishly ornate. It doesn't have a back because it's a throne and there's a specific kind of chair this is, but they are preparing to lay their crowns at the foot of Jesus when he returns to sit on this throne, because Jesus, remember we're here with the Aryans, so Jesus' physical body of human Jesus will return to reign on a throne, real life happening. So that's one way. The hetoimasia, the awaiting throne, is one way that we know this is an Aryan structure, because it is expected that the human body of Jesus will come back to reign on the throne. Another interesting way that we know about this, and let me just see what's next. No. If you zoom in, and unfortunately I can't here, but if you look very closely, Jesus in the middle has no beard. Jesus is depicted as a young man. Now, Jesus, if we take tradition, more so than the Bible itself, but if we take tradition, Jesus was what, about 30 when he was baptized in ancient Israel. Jesus would have had a beard, kind of a long one. But the reason for showing Jesus as a young man is that it necessarily diminishes Jesus himself. It makes Jesus young, it makes Jesus younger, it makes Jesus as less than God the Father, right? So the idea of God the Father as old white man with a beard, very old concept. If we depict Jesus with a beard, then we're starting to skirt into this territory of the equality of God the Father and God the Son. And if God the Son is a creature begotten of the Father, he is therefore necessarily younger than old white man with a beard God. And so the fact that Jesus here is beardless is another symbol that this is the Aryan baptistry. And that's what I say. And we'll see in just a few slides the baptistry of the Orthodox and how these are different. But it's those details that don't seem major, but are major enough that people that looked at this would have walked in and said, oh, I'm in the wrong baptistry. Yes, John.
May I assume that even at this early stage, all the depictions of Jesus are white, like the people of Europe at the time?
So Jesus is white, and actually probably whiter than, I mean, remember we're in Italy, so these are sort of olive skin tone people. Jesus is looking pretty white, yes. At no point thus far, we'll talk about race and Jesus later. Not today, but later in the series. But figure that everybody so far appearing is male, unless I note otherwise, and relatively white.
Okay.
Yes. But so those are two ways that someone would have walked in, looked up at this amazing dome above the waters and said, wait a second, I'm getting baptized in the wrong baptistry. I got to go to the other one. Here is a zoom in on Peter. So this, as blurry as it is, looks like this close up. So you can see the mosaic of it here. So you have Peter. How do we know it's Peter? Because he has keys. This is Paul. How do we know? Because he's holding his letters. Peter and Paul, always the chief apostles, certainly by this time, are sort of leading the procession with the palms, right? The signs of triumph and victory, to lay at the foot of the hetoimasia, the padded throne, waiting. We know Jesus is coming back because there's a cross on it. So we know this is waiting for Jesus with the footstool. Take note here of the Bejeweled Cross. We are still in a time period when we will not see an actual crucifixion, right? It's not until about 450 in, actually probably a little bit later, in Santa Sabina in Rome, where the first depiction of the crucifixion is. And it's really more like bored Jesus with a cross behind him. But there's no like Jesus hanging, dying, last gasping breath. It's more like Jesus with his arms out and the cross happens to be behind him. But the cross and the connection between cross and Jesus is there in the world. We are at a place and a time, so Ravenna, 300s, 400s, where, even a little bit later into the 500s, where there's no longer the shame associated with showing a cross. So that we start to see cross being used more because we're not in an area where crucifixion is still happening, right? So if we remember in the early church, we do not have crosses, we do not have crucifixion scenes because it's still actively happening to people. So there's still the shame associated with Jesus' crucifixion. Whether you were Jewish or Gentile, didn't matter because it was still happening in the world. Now that we're into Ravenna, 3rd, 4th, 5th century, we kind of have gotten rid of that because we're not in a place, because these would have been Roman citizens, they wouldn't themselves have been the ones being crucified, etc. Yes, Larry, you need to unmute yourself. You need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. So I was just going to ask you that, to put that into the context of the time, the Arianism, if I'm saying that right, was that at that time, was that earlier? Was he a major voice then, or was he still someone who had to hide his voice?
No, so the thing is, it's named for Arius, who was a singular priest. As I said, it takes over in kind of most of these, most anything that denies the Orthodox teaching of the person of Jesus gets labeled as Arianism. So what exactly did this particular set of Aryans believe versus Arius himself? Well, that just depends on time and place and how long it's been. But basically what we're saying here is that we are able to depict these things because we are still focused on the human part of Jesus. Because if we remember, the big distinction is that one cannot depict God, right? One cannot depict God. No one has seen it. No one knows what it looks like. There's prohibitions against it, right? We're still living into that. So there's still prohibitions against this sort of personification of or representation of God. And so we can do this if we're Arian because Jesus was human. We can't if we're Orthodox because Jesus is God and you can't depict God. So what we have here is the sealing of the Baptistry of the Orthodox, which, as you will see, is almost exactly the same as the Baptistry of the Aryans. This one is a little bit more intact so that you see not only if you look here, you can see that the walls have been stripped of their tesselae, have been stripped of their mosaic, but these brick walls would have been equally adorned as this one. So these are the walls here. The thing is, in the Baptistry of the Orthodox, the walls remain because they were Orthodox. So they win the fight. So this baptistry gets used well past the days where the other one would have stopped being used. But what we have here is basically the exact same depiction. In the middle medallion, so that in the floor of this room, so an 8-walled room with sort of a round rotunda at the top with a dome. In the floor would have been a deep pool. You would have walked in one side naked, walked out the other side, been wrapped in a white robe, given your candle. You would have walked across the way into the cathedral where you would have received communion for the first time and honey and milk dipped on your tongue. because it was your first time receiving communion, all for adults only at the Easter Vigil. So imagine at the Easter Vigil, that part where at Christ's Ascension, at least since I've been here, we sort of read the story, we read Romans, the idea of for all who've been baptized into Christ and been baptized into his death. We read that outside under the night sky around the baptismal font. Imagine doing that in this room by candlelight so that the gold was flickering and you would have walked in, gotten super wet if you're being baptized, walked out the other side, and then gone over and had communion, right? So there are connections to why we do what we do at Christ's Ascension. But here you see in the middle medallion, you have Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist. There's the dove of the Holy Spirit, and still the personification of the River Jordan, even though the Orthodox probably would have been a little sketchy on that, on depicting a god of the river, but nonetheless, we still have it because we're still trying to compete, right? We're still trying to compete Arian and Orthodox. So you want to be sure your art is as good as the other guy's art. So that we have the same depiction in the middle, except Jesus has a beard. Do I have a zoom in? I don't have a zoom in. Jesus has a beard in this one. He's a little bit older. His hair is actually a little bit gray, as a matter of fact, because we're Orthodox. So we want to depict and infer the co-equality of the Son and the Father. Also, and I will zoom in here, but you see there are 12 apostles carrying their crowns. Here's Peter because he has a white beard. Here's Paul because he's bald and has a big head. And they're literally just going to run into each other. So it's 12 apostles walking in procession, holding their crowns, going to smack right into each other. Because there is no hotoi Messiah. There is no expectancy that we are waiting for the actual physical body of human Jesus to come and reign on a throne like a king. Now, this is not to say that the Orthodox in any way denied the return of Jesus, but sort of this need for a throne, a kingly place to sit and reign, all these things that would have been very human, we don't have. We don't need them. Because as God, the sovereignty of God is what's going to be important. And so we end up with the same depiction, right? This is the same depiction. This one using a little more blue, this one using a little more gold, but same depiction, except we don't have a throne. And again, while it seems minor to us, until you really tease it out, like I do, and spend an hour talking about a throne, but someone in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century would have walked in and said, I'm in the wrong building. I should be in the other one. Because they would have understood what these things mean. And so it's really just this beautiful expression, of these things. I should say all of the pictures we're looking at now are mosaics. So while they're a little blurry and they look like they're painted, they're all 100% mosaics with tiny little tesserae, tiny little tiles, a lot of them gold in these buildings, so that this art really would have been pieced together by true artisans. But lest you think that's the end, there are plenty of other mosaics in Ravenna. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site because of the 8 churches and their mosaics alone. The entire city of Ravenna is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So one of the cathedrals, the Cathedral of the Aryans, is San Apollinare Nuovo, right? San Apollinare, that would be Polyneis of Laodicea, one of the Arian controversy founders. But San Apollinare Nuovo is a beautiful church, and I actually don't think that I have a picture of the basilica in this slideshow, but it's a basilica. So it has a high nave with a clear story at the top, and then along the 2 sides are mosaic depictions of the life of Jesus. And they start, what side do they start on? Do they start on the left or the right? They start on the left and go to the right. So on the left, closest to the altar is this depiction, the first miracle of Jesus. This is Jesus at the wedding at Cana. Here are your jugs of wine. Here's the wine steward. Here's the one filling the water. This is the miracle of the wine at the wedding at Cana. It's the very closest one on the left-hand side facing the altar. And then it goes back and jumps across and goes back up. So on the right closest to the altar will be the next picture that we see. This is Jesus. He appears the same way in all of the mosaic depictions in San Padre Nuevo, with a purple-ish, scarlet-ish toga of a senator, right? This is how you know he's an emperor, a senator. He is a ruling class person, but he also has a halo. He also looks like he's 12. He has a bowl cut and no beard. He looks like he walked right out of high school and started making wine at the wedding at Cana. This is what it looks like. And this is how it starts. And it goes through major miracles and stories. So the calling of the disciples, various parables. There's a beautiful depiction. I think I used it this year. There's a beautiful depiction of the sheep and the goats, etc. But sort of it goes around in these panels. This is the second to last panel. This is the road to the cross. This is the walk of the passion. This is second to last Jesus. Jesus in the middle, still with his purple robe of royalty, still with his halo. Mind you, Jesus doesn't look weak or haggard or beaten up, because we're still not quite depicting that. And next to him, holding what looks like someone holding a popsicle stick, is Simon of Cyrene carrying the cross, kind of slung over his shoulder. There is no weight to this cross. He's just kind of skipping along with this cross next to Jesus. Some of his followers, there's some contention about whether or not this is potentially Pontius Pilate or because of his robes. But who these people are, other people following Jesus. This is Jesus on the way to Calvary. Mind you, Jesus has aged over the course of his lifetime, and so now Jesus has a beard. The beard of Jesus in these pictures, which by the way are what, like 2 stories in the air, and they're all about this big, so like you really got to squint for these. But the mere fact that Jesus grows a beard over the course of these 12 or 14 panels shows us that this is an Aryan cathedral, because Jesus was human and therefore got old. Jesus grew up like a human. So he starts out young, no beard, hair gets longer, beard gets longer, showing that he grows up, showing that he was human. So we know this is a church of the Aryans. Minor details that, I'll be honest, until you look at them, you don't even realize they're there. Minor details that would have said to people, this is what Aryans believe about Jesus. He got old. He grew up. He was human, just like you and me. And so, interestingly enough, there is no crucifixion panel. The next panel after this is the empty tomb. It is curious that in the Church of the Aryans, they focus on Mark's account of the empty tomb, and that's just where the story ends. Because one would think that that was much more orthodox, this idea you can't depict the risen Christ, right? The sort of Godhead. But nonetheless, empty tomb is where they leave Jesus with this story. So this is the closest we have to a crucifixion panel in the Church of San Polyneis Nuevo. But what we look at in this church, in these tiny little panels, is that Jesus grows a beard. And from that alone, we know that this is an Aryan church. Again, if you want sort of an analysis about how detailed this is, each of these panels is about as big as the laptop screen you're looking at. And it's a story and a half, 2 stories in the air, under a window, which means you have light coming from behind it. So these are minor details, but would have been major issues for those that saw them. Not to be outdone by the Aryans, the Orthodox build the Church of San Apollinaris in classe. This is not San Apollinaris Nuevo, sorry about the slide. This is San Apollinaris in classe, it's across the river, but it's still part of Ravenna. This is a beautiful big basilica, a little blurry here, but you don't need to see the details on this one. Here, we don't have most of the mosaics of the nave itself. So we don't know if the nave had an equal story of Jesus where he's old the whole time, We don't know. But Santa Paula Nuovo, we don't have the apse over the altar anymore because they came through and made the entire apse Baroque. And so it looks like it's out of a church that Bach went to. Because they just completely redid it, but left the mosaics. Santa Paula in Classe, they left the apse and changed most of the nave. What is depicted in this apse is that this is the Transfiguration. Here's Elijah on the left, sort of the upper half of Elijah hanging out from a cloud. Here is the upper half of Moses hanging out of a cloud. Remember, everyone was concealed in a cloud. And down here is Peter and James and John depicted as sheep. Underneath this, there are actually 12 sheep representing the 12 disciples further down the mountain, which curiously enough were originally peacocks. But then they got changed over to sheep eventually to map it on. But the idea here is, in this moment of the Transfiguration, when arguably we talk about the revelation of Jesus as God, there's no person. It's a bejeweled cross in a sky of blue with stars. It's a bejeweled cross because you can't depict God. And in this moment, Jesus is God. We know it's Jesus because there's a cross, but you can't depict what it looks like because God. Except, did I zoom in? I did not zoom in. If you zoom in, this medallion in the very center is just the head of bearded Jesus. So we know it's Jesus, but we're not going to depict any part of his body because God. And that's how we know that this church, the other Santa Apollinarii, this one belonging to the Orthodox, is Orthodox because we don't depict Jesus at all in this moment where he's God, because we are focusing on the God part of Jesus rather than the human part of Jesus, right? So Santa Apollinarii Nuovo spends all this time telling the story of Jesus himself, sort of the earthly human story of Jesus as he grew up and did his ministry. And Santa Apollinarii in Classe decides over the apse to put this beautiful depiction of the singular moment in the story of Jesus when he's shown forth as God, right? And that's how we know these are different. Where today in the 21st century, we'd walk in and go, that's a pretty cross. But these details are how we know these controversies played out in actual art. This, also in Ravenna, is the Church of San Vitale. San Vitale is one of the most beautiful churches I've ever been in. It's called a basilica, but it's not at all a basilica. It is a church with 8 sides, but not church in the round. So all these churches that we think of, with the exception of Santo Stefano in Rome, there are churches that are built in the round. They always had an axis. This one has a particularly deep apse on one side so that it was 8-sided, symbol of the resurrection, the miraculous 8th day, the day of perfection. But people would have stood in rows facing the altar in one direction. They wouldn't have been sort of in the round. Most of it, as you see, is sort of is missing, has fallen down. What we know is these huge panels, solid panels of marble is how most of the church would have been decorated, which also over time just doesn't hang onto the walls anymore. But what's gorgeous is the apse. So this is if you were to lay on your back just in front of the altar and look up. And what you see is Jesus with a beard and the 12 disciples down each side of the arch. Jesus with a beard. San Vitale is an Orthodox church. Jesus has a beard. What's more, in the very center panel over the altar is a lamb. No Jesus, no God, not even a cross, but a lamb, right? Because again, can't depict God, but you can use so much of the imagery around Jesus that's used for us to have this. So that what you have over the altar are the 4 angels holding up the lamb in the sky, right? So that we start to get these images of, and you can see the various creatures around the angels that are around the throne of the lamb and the tree with the fruits to heal them, right? You can see all of this depicted in this arch medallion. This is what's over the altar. Now, this is the one confusing part. So the Maiestas Domini of the Christ enthroned, Maiestas Domini is the Latin phrase for majestic Lord. Christ enthroned here has no beard. I'm a little confused by that, I'll be honest. I'm confused by that, except to say that San Vitale is singular in its existence in Ravenna. So that where there's an Arian baptistry and an Orthodox baptistry, there's an Arian San Apollinare and an Orthodox San Apollinare, there is one San Vitale. And over time, various things, and we see this in all the churches, things get added and taken away depending on who's in charge. So I'll be honest, this one's a little strange to me. I'm just going to put that out there. But this is, if you're wondering, this is the person who sponsored San Vitale. And so he's holding San Vitale in his hands, presenting it to Christ enthroned so that, right, so this is what's happening here. But so this is the Maiestas Domini in San Vitale. This is the Maiestas Domini, the Christ enthroned in San Apollinare Nuovo, where Jesus has a beard after the crucifixion and resurrection, right? So that Jesus, right, and as I'm saying this now, I'm realizing the difference, right? So Christ enthroned here, sitting on his hetoimasia, on his waiting throne with no arms. Here, Jesus has gone through all the ordeals as a human, crucified, risen, and rises as he was, right? So rises a 33-year-old man, because he's human, so he comes back that way, rather than the perfection of the risen Christ, who is God. Okay, I'm back. I knew I would remember it. I stalled out there for a second. So, but again, you see this sort of repetition of the same images, just with slightly different depictions, so you know whose it is. Also in San Vitale, because again, remember, we're not representing God, and Jesus is God. On both sides of the altar apse, there are two major depictions so that we know what happens in this space is communion. On one side is the story of Abraham, and chief among it, and most important of it, is when Abraham is visited at the Oaks of Mamre by the three visitors and brings out meal cakes and the fatted calf, and Sarah remains in the tent, although this looks kind of like a house with columns. It's a little more palatial than a tent, but she stays in the tent and giggles. You can see the smile on her face, giggles to herself when being told that she would have Isaac. This is also Abraham. Abraham appears twice, here being told by the angel of God, depicted by the hand coming out of the cloud, as he's literally ready to sacrifice Isaac, but instead the ram shows up, or the lamb shows up. So between sacrifice of an only son and the meal at a table where the Trinity is present, right? All of these being symbols from the Old Testament, but people would have known them deeply as being symbolic precursors of communion. This is on one side. Facing this, two others. Abel, the first person to sacrifice flesh for God, right? So Abel offers his fatted lamb, which God prefers because God always likes barbecue over salad. Cain brings a salad. Abel brings the barbecue. God says, I like the barbecue better. Cain kills Abel, but this sacrifice of a lamb, right? So we're getting into language around communion. But then also interesting is Melchizedek over here. Melchizedek, who shows up in the book of Genesis, where he visits with Abraham for a while and brings out, he is a servant of the Most High God and brings out bread and wine for those who have gathered, and then kind of disappears. Melchizedek, who is from everlasting and unto everlasting, sort of this mysterious figure that shows up for all of 4 verses in the Bible, and yet is this sort of precursor of communion, and also symbolic of the high priesthood of Jesus, right? Thou art a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek, is what the Psalm says and what is quoted again in Hebrews about Jesus himself. But all of these things so that we know, so now because we're in San Vitale, and I couldn't help myself, we're a little bit out of sort of depicting Jesus and more so how do we know these spaces were used? And we know these spaces was used for communion because we have all this communion imagery. Last picture is on the grounds of San Vitale is the Mausoleum of Gala Placidia. Gala Placidia was the second wife of an emperor who was also her second husband, where there's this beautiful depiction of the Good Shepherd. So huge mausoleum for one woman, all of it covered top to bottom in this beautiful blue mosaic, with this really famous image that is actually very, very popular in the ancient church, right? So the earliest church loves depicting the Good Shepherd, always young. The Good Shepherd never has a beard in the early church. That being said, over time, the Good Shepherd grows a beard because we want to map onto blonde-haired, blue-eyed, long-beard Jesus. So we give the Good Shepherd a beard. But in the early church, this is how the Good Shepherd is depicted, right? We are in pastures of green, by streams of water, which I think, by streams of water, which is right down here very lightly. But we know Good Shepherd, we know it's Jesus because holding a cross. Again, we are still not depicting the actual death of Jesus, but we're okay with there being a cross so that we know this is Jesus. And so we are at least comfortable enough to say this is Jesus who is related to the things that happened on the cross. Okay, that's enough of that. We're going to move on and talk about Jesus, the Good Shepherd of the sheep. I am a little sheep. I just want to be a sheep, ba, 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 ba. And now that I'm dead, as Gala Placidia is, this is what I want depicted in my tomb. Curiously enough, also San Lorenzo, Saint Lawrence is depicted and is depicted in almost every church in Ravenna. Major figure, the first, sort of one of the first early martyrs. He's the one who has the fun story about being grilled. So he always shows up with a grill. But he's off to the right over here. But so we're going to end with this depiction of the Good Shepherd here. That's what I have as far as a slideshow for this week. Questions, comments, concerns, stories of your own having seen these or others? Wow, I'm good. Yes, Bex.
Oh, no, just thank you. I haven't looked at these in ages, and they're just so incredibly beautiful. It's a pleasure.
Oh, yeah, they really are.
Now we need to go.
We need to go.
Yeah.
Yes, fair enough.
Let's go. That's the first thing on our post-COVID list.
I was going to say, as soon as there is a post-COVID potential, yes. Yes, it is truly beautiful. And as I said, these are sort of picking and choosing a couple to fit into an hour. But yes, Ravenna is one of those places that you can go and sit and say, this is what it meant in real life, right? So these things we thought about employed artists, right? So one of the things for us to think about throughout this series, as we think about art and artists, is the ways that what we sometimes think of as these sort of ivory tower philosophical, theological debates that people can have for generations was like people's livelihood. People were like, yes, I want to put in my quote to be the one to make the picture of the whatever, right? So that it could be depicted, right? So that we have all these ways that these things are connected. As I've said before, and I will say again in this series, things like Michelangelo and Raphael are a result of Luther, like thank you, Luther, because the church needed to combat the printing press to teach the teachings of the church. And so we see this huge influx of money go into the sort of art of the Counter-Reformation, which is what this series, what this whole time frame is, because we had to teach it. We had to have the better art. We had to have, right? And so it's just these wonderful things to see the way that it plays out.
So cool.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
I thought
yes, Tom.
It's probably it's stating the obvious, but it strikes me that neither in Ravenna, neither the Orthodox nor the Aryans had any hesitation to lavish the buildings with ornament. There wasn't any.
They weren't stingy with the tesseract.
They didn't have a problem with architectural elaboration and embellishment.
Yeah, and so we will talk a little bit about sort of the iconoclasm and all that sort of stuff as we go, but that's a very late development, right? Art in the church of all kinds, East, West, and otherwise, is a big deal for a very long time, until we get into sort of this sentiment of sort of anti-something. But even then, it quickly goes away. But I mean, we see that, the major distinction really comes much later when we get debates over whether or not you can have statues, right? Art is fine, paintings are good, but statuary is graven, right? So a painting is not a graven image. But if we're going to have a prohibition in the Ten Commandments against graven images, can we have statues? And that's where you start to see the Western church go towards statuary and the Eastern church go towards icons, right? So that icons are painted with depth, but are not 3D. They're painted or written, right? Icons are written, even though they're painted, but they're written. And that's where you get around sort of the big distinction is, can they be graven? And the Western church kind of goes, well, maybe this one doesn't apply to us so much because we like the art. And the Eastern church says, no, you can't have it graven, so we'll have these paintings. Yeah. All right, folks, I'm looking at the time. It is good to always be with you all. And